located on 160 Central Avenue, and they're having a forum. The Cuban Caravan is coming. Well, they're here already. And the guest speaker at that forum is Gail Walker, who's Executive Director of IFCO and the Pastor for Peace. And I have her right here with me. How you doing, Gail?
I'm very good. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me.
All right. Gail, tell me something about yourself.
Well, I am the Executive Director currently of IFCO, the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization. This is a faith-based organization committed to the fight for social justice. We've been around for 50 years. My father was the founding director, the late Reverend Lucius Walker, Jr. He passed away in 2010. But I've known about IFCO, I guess you could say by birth. I've been around it since I was a kid and felt really committed to finding ways for IFCO to continue to do its work. So I came on as director in 2011. And my background is in media and journalism, so I like to talk and felt it was important to talk about the work that IFCO does, including the work around the annual Cuba caravans that we organize.
Now it says you're the Pastor for Peace and IFCO. Are they one and the same?
No, IFCO is the parent organization, the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization. It was founded by progressive clergy and lay people interested in really using their, as people of faith and people of conscience, using their platform to talk about justice-related issues. That is as broad as, you know, support for the rights of workers, the women, fighting the violence of the Ku Klux Klan, working with the Native American population, the American Indian movement. Those were some of the things that we did in our earlier years. In the latter years, we did international work in Southern Africa, fighting against the apartheid, but you know, supporting African liberation struggles, and also in Central America, fighting against Ronald Reagan's policy of low-intensity warfare, and more recently in Cuba, fighting against the blockade policy that the U.S. government has imposed. Pastors for Peace is a project of IFCO, which came about as a result of some of the work in Central America and the Caribbean. But it's the caravans, the annual caravans that we've organized. We've done that under the banner of Pastors for Peace.
So what prompted y'all to begin to organize this campaign for 2019?
Well, we've been doing these caravans for 30 years. This is the 30th U.S.-Cuba Friendshipment Caravan that's been organized under Pastors for Peace. And we feel it's important to continue to do the work, despite the fact that things are a little different than they were perhaps when the blockade or the embargo, the economic embargo, was first imposed. Cubans refer to it as a blockade, and we think that there's some value to that. The blockade is a way to impose restrictions on Cuba internationally, and the U.S. has done that. But whether you call it an embargo or a blockade, the reality is that the policy has created incredible hardship for the Cuban people. And as people who hunger for justice, we felt it was important for us to talk about what our government, what our tax dollars are being used for when it comes to harming the people of Cuba. So that's why we've continued to organize these trips. But also, I think it's important to note, it's to talk about the role that this policy plays for the people in the United States. Because we're not able to do certain things or have certain access to certain things that Cuba provides because of this long-standing policy of blockade that our government has imposed. So we do the caravans to educate people about those kinds of things. And this happens to be this year's caravan, and we're committed to doing this until we can turn this policy around.
Now, just another question about the caravan. So the caravan, you've been doing it for 30 years, so it starts in the U.S., and what is the end game of the caravan every year?
So we stop in different communities, like right here today in Albany, and this route alone, we'll be stopping in 10 different cities. We've got 5 different routes that we'll be stopping in cities. So all told, we'll be hitting 45 U.S. cities, talking about Cuban reality, educating people, collecting little symbolic aid, material aid, medical supplies, school supplies, things of that nature. And then together, we will meet up all of the people participating. There'll be 37 in total, who will be participating in this year's caravan. Will travel to Mexico City. We'll meet up with our friends in Mexico who are friends of Cuba, and then travel to Cuba for 10 days.
So you have so New York is not the only place where the caravan is?
No. New York is where our office is.
Uh-huh.
And that's where we launched the caravan back in June 8th. But we've stopped, this route alone, we've stopped in Washington and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and a variety of other cities. We're here in Albany. We'll be going up to Maine, to Boston, back to Connecticut. Like I said, there'll be 45 cities in total. Our home base is in New York, but we'll be in various other cities as well.
Okay. Well, let me just ask you something about the policy of the U.S. You know, what is the U.S. foreign policy towards Cuba right now? Well,
it's really been an effort to really undermine and destabilize Cuba. The economic policy since almost the beginning of Cuba's revolution back in 1959 has been one of embargo. That was initially a unilateral embargo between the United States and Cuba, but the United States has put pressure on other countries to also suspend trade and suspend relations with Cuba, and that's why it's referred to as a blockade. But for decades now, the effort has been to completely cripple the Cuban people, cripple the government, and hurt the Cuban people so that they will lose faith in their socialist system of government. The United States has been obsessed with Cuba almost from the beginning of time, if you will. But this idea, this embracing of manifest destiny that the United States government has held on to, and that was just recently lifted up again by John Bolton when he started talking about some of the current restrictions that the government has placed on travel. Travel that was made a little easier under Barack Obama has been reversed under this current administration. And while announcing this change, there was this embracing of this idea that we, the United States of America, have the right to control the hemisphere. This idea of manifest destiny, which has been, a piece of U.S. policy, a part of U.S. policy making for decades, is once again, being referred to even under this current administration.
So you think that's part of the reason why they continue to do things against Cuba, as opposed to why not China? Why not the Soviet Union and other countries? But Cuba, it seems like it's just a continuous policy to kind of keep them out of the loop of progression.
You hit it right on the head. It makes no sense. It's nonsensical. We had an opportunity to meet with some high school students, and they're just scratching their heads. Are saying, we don't get it. Why is the government continuing to do this? The only thing that we can point to is we think that Cuba represents a threat of a country that has said, you know what, when it comes to health care, we're going to provide that for the vast majority of people. You know what, when it comes to education, those who are struggling to educate their children so that they can have a better life, we're going to provide that free and accessible to everyone. When it comes to the rights of women and health care, abortion free and on demand, when it comes to what it takes to really focus on the environment and to push back against global warming and climate change, the government's taking a front seat to that, and that goes against what our government in the United States is about when it comes to being supportive of capital and businesses that see those kinds of advancements as a threat. So we think that in many ways, the power brokers in this country see Cuba as a threat, the threat of a good idea, and that's why they've continued all these years to embargo and blockade Cuba.
So how have the people of Cuba adjusted to this continuous threat, from the U.S. to the country today?
It's been amazing what the Cuban people, the ingenuity, the tenacity of the people of Cuba is miraculous. And I think anybody who's ever had a chance to actually travel to Cuba and see that themselves, is able to remark on the ability of the people to push back. It's hard times. There's difficult challenges that they are forced to endure as a result of a long-standing blockade policy. But there's also the will of the majority of people in the country to hold on to what they feel is rightfully their sense of self-determination. And so it's been really heartening to watch the people of Cuba continue to persevere despite all of the hardships that have been imposed upon it as a result of the policies of the United States government.
Okay. So now the pastor piece, the caravan is going across, the country. What do you want, American communities to do, or the ordinary people, in the communities to do?
There's a few things that we think that people can do. We think that, number one, it's important for people to educate themselves about Cuba. We have a website, IFCOnews.org. There's some of the materials that we have up on our website to talk about health and education, and a med school scholarship program that Cuba offers that we are able to help facilitate for people who want to go to Cuba to study medicine under full scholarship. So one is to educate themselves about Cuba. Two is to encourage members of their elected officials to look at supporting legislation that will really provide for a change in U.S. policy.
Mm-hmm.
There are efforts to push back on the restrictions against travel. There are efforts within Congress to really look at exchange of business opportunities between the United States and Cuba. There are medical really incredible medical technology that Cuba has been able to pioneer. Learn about those things. Push for the opportunity for us in the United States to receive those things. But most importantly, people should go to Cuba. And I think we can't be frightened by the fact that the current administration is really trying to frighten people into going to Cuba. A lot of people want to go to Cuba. They should be able to go, see it for themselves. And so those are at least three major things that we think people ought to be doing in this coming period.
Okay. And I notice one thing, when we bring up this issue in the black communities, a lot of people say, why should I worry about Cuba when I got health issues, environmental issues to worry about, or employment issues? Mm-hmm. Tell them why should they still keep Cuba on their mind?
Yeah.
Or worry about foreign.
Absolutely, and I appreciate you really asking that question. I think that there's so many different things, particularly our community can relate to when it comes to Cuba. Historically, Cuba has always stood up for the black community, has always been forefront in the fight for African liberation struggles, fought side by side to push back against the apartheid. When Ebola broke out in Africa, when other countries were running from the fight, Cubans were running to the fight to provide support. So there's that historic reality of Cuba's support of the black people in the diaspora. The medical school scholarship program that I just referenced, opportunity for young people to go to Cuba, study, to become doctors, debt-free, graduating with no debt, with the only understanding being that they'll come back and provide in their own communities. Well, that's a gift. That's a tremendous gift, and the majority of people in IFCO, my organization, facilitates this process. The majority of the graduates and the currently enrolled students are black and brown students. So this is another gift that, that Cuba has continued to try to provide to our community. I think that the reality is that when it comes to, you mentioned health issues, diabetes is prevalent in our community, right? I mean, there's probably not any one of your listeners that has not either have a family member or know of someone who has been impacted by diabetes. And one of the horrible side effects of diabetes is amputations because of the foot ulcers or the wounds that come with having diabetes. Cuba has a treatment, a diabetic foot ulcer treatment that helps to prevent the continuous amputation process for those who are suffering from diabetes. That has a direct impact on our community. So those are just a couple of different ways in which specifically black folk ought to, understand what it is that this tiny island nation of 11 million, what it represents and what it can do for our community. And that's part of what we are always interested in trying to talk about when we organize this caravan, because these are not the things that people are learning or hearing about when they hear about Cuba. They're hearing only, a boatload of negative things about Cuba. And we're here to talk about some of those positive things.
Right, and I think it was Malcolm X said, a long time ago, said that you can't understand what's happening in Mississippi if you don't understand what's happening in Africa.
That's right.
Or in other part of the world. That you have to understand what's happening in those countries because it relates to what happened in your community.
Absolutely.
All right.
Right.
And Gail, I want to thank you for that interview.
Thank you.
And is there any last minute thing you want to say?
No, we just want to encourage people to, to be critical thinkers. Don't just kind of go with the flow of what the maybe elected officials might say or mainstream media might say. We have to dig deep, because to get a real clear understanding of what's going on in the world and to really apply that intelligence that we, and I know that your listeners have, as we continue to understand how it is that we're going to grapple through all of these changes. People can go to our website, learn more about the Caravan and some of the work that we do, including the Med School Scholarship Program, and that website is www.ifconews.org.
And if they want to get involved in your organization?
Absolutely, they can reach out to us. They can reach us at 212-926-5757. That's 212-926-5757. There is a way on the website to leave a message, and we can certainly share any information about some of the projects and programs that we're engaged in.
All right, and thank you again, Gail.
Thank you so
and
much.
That's Gail Walker, Executive Director for IFCO and the Pastor of Peace, and he's traveling with the Pastor of Peace Caravan.
Yes, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
All right.